Kia ora koutou, and welcome to this amazing session, and with some fantastic women we've got to share and focus on the topic of the ethnic pay gap and how we can turn the impact of COVID-19 into a more positive and of course more equal future for our ethnic communities. Now, many of you will know some of the high level data. Many of us know the gender pay gap off by heart. But do we know that Māori on average earn 85% less than the average European? And do we know that Pacific public servants earn 20% less than their non-Pacific colleagues? Now, they can just sound like statistics, fairly big statistics and fairly, in some ways, disappointing statistics. But I think we need to start with behind these numbers are people. There are people and families and whānau, and these numbers do decide about whether those families have a warm house and a full tummy tonight. So who does and who doesn't. So there's a human face behind these figures we'd like to talk about today. But these numbers also tell a story to me, and I'm sure to you as well, about as a society what we value and what we don't value. Because whether we like it or not, we use money as an indicator of value. So some jobs are deemed more important, some jobs are deemed more valuable, some skills are more valuable, and unfortunately that means some people are more valuable to us than others. Some people don't have access to roles that pay well, and some do. So to address pay gaps, we're going to have conversations around issues of discrimination, of structural racism, of structural sexism. So the pay gap conversation isn't a conversation just about numbers. It's about people and the day-to-day reality of their lives, but also about the structures that we've created around us to order ourselves. So I'm very much looking forward to being part of this conversation this afternoon. But I'll take a moment now to introduce the amazing women and the amazing experiences and the amazing talent we have on our panel today. First, I'd like to introduce Lisa Lawrence, Ngāti Kahungunu and Ngāti Ruapani. Lisa is the new president of the National Council of Women, and her career is involved working with iwi-based health and social services, the New Zealand College of Midwives, St John, New Zealand Family Planning. I can go on because this is an amazingly accomplished woman here. She is currently the kai whakahari of the Motueka Family Service Centre and a core stakeholder of 3 Reducing Family Violence community networks. So welcome, Lisa. It's such an honour to have you here with us today. Now, I'd also like to introduce you to Judy Mataia. Judy is the Chief Executive of the Anglican Trust for Women and Children, and she has an amazing background working in the not-for-profit sector, as well as being a skilled policy analyst in fields of youth development, crisis intervention, program evaluation, and case management. And she's been a vocal advocate for recognising and closing the ethnic pay gap in Aotearoa. So welcome, Judy. We're very privileged to have you with us here today. And last, but of course not least, we have the amazing Filzila. Filzila is the Principal Advisor Diversity Inclusion at Auckland Council. Now, her career has focused on developing expertise in diversity and inclusion across many sectors, and she has significant experience in central government working with the Office of Ethnic Communities, developing the ethnic responsiveness strategic policy and best practice. Welcome, it's such a pleasure to have you here with us. To give you a rundown of how the session is going to work, we have invited each of our amazing panellists to take a moment to share their views about the ethnic pay gap, and perhaps also to focus on some key numbers, some key indicators, but also start to unpick what we can actually do to address it. Now, Lisa has kindly volunteered to go first. So over to you, Lisa, my friend.
Kia ora, Jo. Thank you for that warm welcome. Ngā mihi nui, ngā mihi mahana, ngā mihi aroha ki a koutou. Warm Pacific greetings from a not very warm and not very sunny Nelson. Thank you for having us all here, Jo. It's great to have the opportunity to talk on something that's really important to me, to my family, to my community, which is the gender and the ethnic pay gaps that our people experience. People are often quite familiar with the gender pay gap, which writes things down to about a 9% gap between tāne and wahine. But when we dive into the underneath and the layers of our communities and the data that supports the real story, there is an astonishing discrepancy between what Pākehā, Māori, Pasifika and our Asian whānau are paid for the jobs that they do. And frankly, it's appalling. It's too large and it's gone on for far too long. And the thing that concerns me the most about this is the different types of opportunities and outcomes that it brings for our communities. I know that whānau that are living within a community that is non-Pākehā, that is Pasifika, Māori or Asian, are looking at some really different outcomes in terms of lifespan, in terms of opportunities of where their work will go and their educational attainment. And that is just unacceptable. We're in the 21st century. This should be last century's vintage history that we should be looking at. And unfortunately, here we are. So I'm quite frustrated. And I think that it's time that New Zealand as a whole got really uncomfortable with that status quo. It's been in place for many years. It's brought up often at the UN within CEDAW, which is a particular type of looking at the elimination of discrimination, particularly against women. However, it dives deeper, and year on year, the examination of New Zealand says that our discrimination pay gaps for gender are just simply, and ethnicity, are just not good enough. For Māori, for every dollar that a Pākehā man earns, we are earning about 80 to 82 cents. So that's my spending power is cut by 20% compared to one of my neighbours down the road. And for my Pacific whānau, it's even more appalling at about 70, 72, 77% less. And that 77 cents in the dollar of a Pākehā man's pay packet. And I'm just frustrated. And I think that is a reflection of a greater community frustration that it would be remiss not to mention at this point around the Black Lives Matter impact is having on our communities at the moment and on New Zealand. And I do think that we're coming to a point in time where being uncomfortable and having confronting conversations is something we need to be having both as institutions and as communities and within our respective NGO sectors about what is the reality for our people.
Oh, kia ora, Lisa. I think you've given us some really powerful messages there. And I think many of us share your frustration. The gender pay gap and our ethnic pay gaps is not something we ever want to pass on to our children. We need to eradicate them now, my friend. Thank you. And now we'll move to Judy. Share your thoughts with us, Judy.
Ngā mihi kia koutou. Nice to see my wonderful sisters, and thank you, Joe, for kind of bringing us together. Talofa lava, māloa lelei, whakalofa lahi atu. Yeah, I might go, Lisa. That's exactly what I'm going to be your hype girl, and just, you know, absolutely support everything you've raised, because one of the things that I've certainly noticed, and probably more so in the chief executive role, actually even when I was in a general manager role, when you get to see overarching across a big organization actually how disparate some of these things are, and I'm inside the machine, you know. But my background has also come out of a government department, and I think that was my first indication actually as a young care and protection social worker in Auckland. And you know, you kind of find out these things around pay disparity by accident. You know, you're around the table having this conversation, and I remember being interviewed maybe a couple of years back about this very same topic, and doesn't feel like much has moved. But I was sharing that I'd done an undergraduate degree, I'd done a master's degree, and was now in a government department, sitting around the table, and one of my colleagues had kind of just said, oh, well, you know, I get this much of my salary. And I suddenly thought, well, I know you only hold a diploma. He's Balangi man. And, you know, I speak another language. Like I'm fluent in Samoan, and we have this conversation. then he tells me how much he was paid. And I thought, how does that happen? I'm in the government department and I hear this man getting more. And so a few of us walk off into the corner and saying, did you hear what he said? Did you hear how much he got paid? And so that was probably my first kind of exposure to thinking, this system is not fair. This system in a government agency served him better than it served me. And I remember thinking, much later on, I've had the privilege of being a decision maker, but also those stats, Lisa, that you raised around, my Balangi male colleague would get 100,000 and I would get 74,000 for doing the same job. But what that means is the kind of buying power, for lack of a better description, what that means for his ability to show better kind of credit history, and sending your children to particular schools and living in different areas, being able to support your family and then your extended family, which is essentially what collective Māori and Pasifika families innately do. It's never just it's the supporting of everyone else's extended family. So I mean that has irked me for a long time, and it stays with me, even in this role. So as a chief executive, the other thing I also see is as my Māori, Pasifika, and my migrant staff, my ethnic staff, never come to negotiate their pay. When we have these conversations around employment contracts, I can 99% tell you they never come back to me as the chief executive to renegotiate. My Balangi colleagues, my Balangi Pākehā staff, not the same. They're very, very quick to ask for a meeting with me. They want to sit down with me. They want to kind of negotiate. And so there's something else in that space that really worries me, because we're in this space in a day and age where so much is available for you to go about negotiating, facilitating a meeting with key people that can say, actually, you're worth a lot more than you give yourself credit. And so those are the sorts of things that I hopefully have a conversation a little bit later, Jo, in this space. But when we think about the system that allows this to happen, and it does, what are we charged with to kind of create change?
Oh, thank you, Judy, and thank you for sharing a bit of your personal experiences, because again, in those numbers is a person, they're all people and they're all having experiences similar to you. So thank you for sharing with us. Felzila, I know you've got some slides to share with us. We're really looking forward with those. Tell us your views, my friend.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jo. Kia koutou katoa, everyone. It's a real pleasure and a privilege to be on this panel. I couldn't agree more with Lisa and Judy in terms of their experiences and obviously their insight from senior leadership roles. What I wanted to do today was share a little bit about the work that we've been doing at Auckland Council around the ethnic pay gap and how we got there, and what we're doing to sort of start addressing some of the drivers of that pay gap. So I'm going to share the data, but before I do that, I just wanted to say how we actually got here and be really transparent. So at Council, like most organisations, we do a gender pay gap analysis, which we do every year and as part of the norm. But this year we asked for an intersectional approach and looking at both gender and ethnicity. And that was very telling, and actually what that led us to do is decide that what we needed to do was actually look at the ethnic pay gap with gender as the intersection. So it's not to diminish the role of gender, but just to say how powerful ethnicity was on our data in terms of the impact. So I'm just going to share my screen, and I want to caveat this by saying this is preliminary data that we're still in the process of verifying COVID's obviously sort of come in and had an impact on our work program. But what it shows, as you can see, is very similar to what you've already heard, the state services data, the Treasury data. There's a pattern here, and this is looking at our permanent staff, because council's a very big employer of more than 8,000 people, and looking at where people sat in terms of the percentage of the band, because we have bands at council like most government and local government agencies, in comparison, looking between different ethnicities. And what you see is not unsurprising, but you see that pattern that we've been talking about, that we've heard our other speakers speak to, replicated with European being the most well paid and Pacifica being the least well paid. Now, the MILA category is an interesting one. The Middle Eastern, Latin American, and African category is a little bit complicated because it's a very small sample size within council compared to the other groups. So it sometimes doesn't present the best picture statistically. But what you can see is our preliminary data showed a gap of 4% between European and Pacific employees. And I just wanted to draw that idea of the difference between the pay gap and pay equity. So in this pay gap, we're just looking at overall averages of pay between different groups. But we're also interested, and we've done some work on this, and I'll share a little bit about that later on, about looking at people doing the same type of work, and is there a gap when you look at that? Is there a pay equity gap? And we've found some data to support that there is. But carrying on with the pay gap data, this is really important for us, because what this shows is a similar pattern when we look at ethnic salary differences on appointment. It's a very similar pattern to what you saw in the previous slide, which suggests, unsurprisingly, and just picking up on what Judy was saying about people not negotiating perhaps, or various other factors that come into it. But if we don't get the salary that we should be getting upon appointment, we tend to have that same pattern replicated through our careers. So that is something that we know is really critical and continues to reflect that pattern. And then the third thing, and this is where we started to see some really interesting results come out, is when you overlay ethnicity with gender, or gender with ethnicity, however you look at it, you start to see the hierarchy that most of us know through our own lived experience and observation. And you start to see that we have our, and I think it's worth noting that our Asian and Pacifica men are not doing as well either. So we don't want to lose the ethnicity lens entirely, but just focusing on the women here. But so we do see there are some challenges there, but we start to also see this sort of dropping down as we start to get into the Asian female, Māori female, Mila female, and of course Pacifica female. So again, we have a very clear hierarchy that's established, and while there's some variations, the pattern is the same. So really briefly, I won't sort of labour this, but why are we here? Well, there's multi layers to that question. But when we looked at our senior leadership, we saw that over 80% of our enterprise leaders identify as European, and only 4% of our senior leaders are Māori and Pacifica, despite the much more significant proportion of the population that they represent. For an organisation like ours, like any public service organisation, not to reflect a demographic makeup is a critical issue. And so our senior leadership, our chief executive, have all acknowledged this, and this is why we have our own diversity and inclusion framework that focuses on a few different areas. But one of the things that's probably the most significant really is us trying to ensure that we have better representation of ethnic and gender diversity at a very senior level, and we've even set targets around that, which are complex, and targets bring up all sorts of responses. I see Joe smiling because I know that's certainly been an issue for Ministry of Women's Affairs, but we believe in the value of the targets, and we're really driving that through inclusive recruitment, through our talent pipeline, and obviously through lateral hiring and some very targeted programs. So I'll probably just stop there if that's okay, Joe. And
yeah, no, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing an insight into how this plays out in an organisation. Obviously, we've talked about how it plays out for an individual, but how it plays out for a staff is really fascinating to see that you can quantify it. So often when I've been working in this space, I get a lot of pushback to go, it's not real, it's made up, they're not, that, you know, there's no real gaps. It's, you know, I've heard everything. It's just women don't want to work hard enough, or they just don't put themselves out there, all these kind of things. But when you start to see the numbers like that, there's systematic discrimination and structural barriers at play. And we can see that across the whole economy. Now, for those of you who are enjoying this conversation, if you look at the bottom of, or perhaps it's on the top of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. Now, that is for you to ask questions of these fantastic women we have with us today. So I will be having a look at the questions that you come through. I've got a few questions to get us started on our panel discussion, but we have plenty of time for you to share your questions. And I think we would really like to focus on not so much, as they say, admiring the problem, but what can we actually do about it? What collectively, what say as global women members, what for those of us that are in positions of power, how can we actually move the dial on these statistics that we all know, if we showed the trend data, aren't necessarily getting any better at any fast rate. So I'm going to first start off with a question to our panelists. Why do you think, perhaps when you start to see these figures in such, I guess, bluntness, if that makes sense, and I'm sure when we start to see them and think about them, they're really uncomfortable. Why are we not perhaps seeing an urgency across, I guess, at a national level or at a community level or in or in the business community to address these issues when they are, I guess, so stark, so, you know, so systemic? Would anyone like to start with that to answer that question?
Jo, could I just offer something as a starter? You know, I think one of the real challenges we have, and everyone's alluded to this already, is that there is a belief that there are objective factors that explain the ethnic pay gap. So, for example, we don't, one of the ideas I heard was that, you know, migrants, for example, coming into the country don't have New Zealand experience, so I might appoint them to a role, but I'm hiring them, so isn't that good? But I'm going to give them a lower pay grade because they don't have New Zealand experience. Or women don't want senior level, you know, jobs, or they're not as good. And I think there's some truth to the negotiation one, but you know, there is a number of, you know, of supposedly objective factors that explain this away, because this is so confronting and uncomfortable for people to think that actually it's just systemic racism at play and we've got the data.
Yeah,
so that's my
thought. And increasingly the research shows that, because there used to be that women aren't educated as much, and so therefore we shouldn't be paid as much, but nearly all those factors are or equal, or actually women are more educated, but yet the pay gap persists. So the role of discrimination, I think, is that researchers have concluded, is increasingly apparent in the gap, I think, moving forward. Lisa or Judy, did you have any comments on that? Why are we not, you know, in arms about this?
I think that there is some complacency of, there can be a section of our community that are very much, she'll be right. We'll get there, until it's brought to their attention that it is their daughters, it is their sisters, it is their wives, it is their joint household income if they happen to be a nuclear family, that will be quite impacted over their lifespan. So there is a nuance of New Zealand culture that does push away those kinds of conversations from occurring. We don't have some parts of our community are not highly individualistic, so it's more about contributing to your family, contributing to the traditionally unpaid work within your whānau and your ainga. That is where perhaps your family may or may not value you and see your particular role. So there's some unspoken rules that we live by. We do generally have a lot of political apathy, despite today and the last 3 months worth of huge change. But traditionally New Zealanders are reasonably apathetic politically around making things a little bit different and making things better. We feel, I think, quite removed from a lot of the cultural change that would happen if we had a land border with another country. So I do think that these are long-standing community attitudes, and out racism, which New Zealand would be quite appalled to think that they may be contributing and participating in racism.
Mm. Oh, thanks, Lisa, for your thoughts there. Judy?
Yeah, I mean, I agree entirely with Fazila and Lisa, and would only just add that, you know, I agree that there's a level of apathy sometimes in the sense that, oh, well, you just be glad that you got your foot in the door.
Yeah.
You know, and then work your way up the system. And there's something in the space where actually it's the valuing of what you bring to that door in the first place.
Yeah.
And how you present that as a really marketable package. And sometimes there is just you know, Lisa said it, she'll be right. Just, you know, get in there and then let them see what you've got. Well, actually, they should see that first up as you know, either on paper, you present yourself, and even how resumes come across, and whether as managers or GMs, you know, we're so attuned to what that might mean for a Māori woman, or you know, someone who's Pacifica or in the Mila group, that's a little bit different from how they would normally compare with you know, their Palangi counterparts.
I think that's a really good observation. There was a large study done by the Lean in McKinsey last year that showed that women started on lower salaries because they were offered them and never ever recovered, but also never got to the first rank of management. And I guarantee if I say woman, we could replace that with Māori Pacifica. So that it happens really quite early and quite systemically if we start to map it. But okay, so what are we going to do about it? What needs to happen to change the dial if we don't want this to be a legacy for following generations? That's a big question, my friends. Who wants to have a go at that first?
I mean, I'll just share a little bit about what I've done, and part of it has been enabled because of my position, and because of the reach that I get across other chief executives. And so I do have the platform to kind of bring things to their attention. Whether in the NGO space, it's even more kind of market, and Joe, you'll know this from the work that you've done in social services, but you know, getting alongside them, consciously bringing it to their attention around looking at their workforce, and looking at those pipelines. I think, Fazila, you're the one who talked about having something that's quite you know, and structured and rigid, and that people understand that these are the steps that's required to go through, rather than a kind of hit and miss, I'll just guess my way through management. But also I think there's real value for, which is what I really got out of the global women's space, was having some strong mentorship in that space, who could open those doors for you, who recognize that actually that speed bump has been a really, really long speed bump, you know, that we just don't seem to be able to get past. So those are some really, it sounds easy, but we obviously haven't done it right in the past, because we're still finding ourselves looking at the data year on year and thinking, is it getting any better?
Yeah.
Fazila, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, totally, obviously agree with what Judy said, and I think the deliberate part for us has been, I don't think this is the only thing, but what Targets has done is that it sets a benchmark. I mean, what's measured counts, and by doing that, you also create accountability for not meeting targets, but you also have to put in place a way to help widen traditional pools, help redefine merit, help the onboarding and the success for people of colour who traditionally don't occupy senior leadership roles. but are highly competent, you know, to create the network. I think there's data around, you know, if you have one woman on a board, it won't have an impact, but you need a critical mass of 30% or something like that. And I think about it, and I'm sure the other women on the panel can relate, when you're the only person of colour in a room of you know, usually Pākehā men, and you're having to present a view that is challenging or whatever, you know, how hard that is and what that requires. So I think we, you know, just getting people to the table is the critical factor, and then we change culture, in my view.
Yeah, absolutely. And Lisa?
Yeah, I really want to support what Judy and Fazila have shared. I absolutely tautoko the contributions, and I wanted to pick up on something that I think you mentioned, Fazila, which is around, we're dealing with a capitalist model, we're dealing with a Pākehā dominant model that was imported into this country, and that now that's a lot of foundation and a lot of bases. And so I almost want to play them at their own game, because if the only thing they're going to respond to is better economic outcome or better outcomes, whatever the KPI is, show them the data that decision making is of a better, higher quality, and you get a better outcome if your table of decision makers is diverse, gender, ethnicity, and ability. So I would play the game, the capitalist game, and play their ear for what is most important, apparently, which is KPIs of whatever the entity is, that they will get a better outcome that will serve their model. That said, I have a huge amount of issues with the capitalist model. And I also wanted to pick up on a few things around leadership and our visibility there. And Sonu Mali, Dr. Karanina Sumio, has been a huge influence on my whakaaro and my thinking. She's talked a lot with me about transparency of wages amongst entities. And I think that that's something we need to really consider, is putting all the cards on the table of what roles are earning what. And then there is no more smoke and mirrors. There is no more ability, as Judy shared with us, about having this experience of someone much lower qualified sitting on a pay packet that isn't commensurate with colleagues who are far better qualified. So I think there's a number of strategies around targets, around quotas, and around pay transparency, and bringing it to the table as this is going to improve the things that you want to be doing within your business.
We've had a fantastic question from one of our audience members. Thanks, Karen Aspie, who asked that exact question. What do you think the role of pay transparency could be? And I would add a question to it, as somebody who's been nagging, that's the wrong word, strongly advocating for, in a leadership way, for pay transparency, having seen the impact that it made in the UK and Australia on their gender pay gap. What's getting in the way of us here adopting such a thing? Any insights?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Judy, go ahead.
I was just going to use the example of the social workers pay parity, which, Joe, I know you are aware of. You know, when we're faced with social workers who can go to a statutory role at either health, you know, drug and alcohol, or even oranga tamariki and NGOs. And when you see that a social work, what it's enabled is the transparency of what is being paid to individuals. The fallout of that has then become, well, why would I work for an NGO? Why would I work for community social services when I can get, for the same job that I get paid 54,000, I'll get 78,000 as a starter. And so that level of transparency has had a kind of different consequence to the whole sector, but that's been useful for us to use as the target, because otherwise, it comes back to the valuing of the work that's done. And I know that in Auckland, largely the social work in NGO space is Māori and Pasifika women, actually mothers, mostly. And, you know, there is research that also suggests that the gender pay gap for mothers is even worse than if you were, you know, not a mother. So if you're a speaker and you're a mother, you're even further down the scale. But I am in favour, and you're right, Lisa, I think the work that Karanina has done around, you know, advocating for transparency just like puts all the cards out there for a conversation to happen, to say, well, this looks different, this doesn't look right, what can we do?
Yeah, points well made, Judy. Either Lisa, Felzia?
Yeah, I did have a few
Yeah.
around this one, and I think it's letting, there are people that have a lot that stand to lose a lot, maybe up to $20,000 compared to their counterparts per year, if we go to something that's different. So there is a large section of our leadership where the status quo is quite comfortable for their own personal pay packet, for the pay packets of their friends. So that's something that I don't think we want to deal with as a community, and that's that whole stepping back, not leaning into courageous conversations, that this suits some people.
Yeah, I don't know that I can add anything to what Judy and Lisa have said, except to say obviously we support Karanina's work, and the Pay Transparency campaign council formally supports it, and we have banned, I mean, we have a part way move towards transparency because roles are banded, and so you know, but there is obviously, you've seen data already that there's the potential for variation within that band based on ethnicity. So we are looking at what might be next steps for us.
We have seen some brave leadership in this space. So we have seen Westpac off their own back release their gender pay gap as a large corporate, and it was very interesting talking to David McLean as he went through that process, and nothing happened. They didn't lose customers. In fact, if anything, they won customers and won more loyalty from their staff, because they were prepared to show, actually, they don't have it's about 26%. It's a very unattractive gender pay gap, but they were brave enough to take the leadership on it. And so even without, say, a government process, we have a few scattering of leaders who are brave enough to do this. But why don't we have more? Any insights? I mean, Lisa, you've said that it's, you know, I think there's a lot of fear around this, but if you, I've also, I guess, have had the privilege of working with organisations, and many just don't know their gender pay gap or have chosen not to see it. And if you can't see it, it doesn't exist, right? But as soon as you see it, you can't unsee it. So there's a real merit in kind of encouraging that conversation, or even regulating that conversation, that you actually go and look, because once you've seen, it's a very cruel organisation that doesn't seek to address. Would that be fair? Yeah.
I think, Jo, I mean, this bit possibly a bit controversial, so I'll just put this out there as a personal statement rather than a council one. You know, I think people are much more comfortable with the gender pay gap conversation than the ethnic pay gap. And that's not to say we've nailed gender, but you know, I don't know many, apart from the work that State Services is doing in Treasury, I'm not aware of many private organisations who are looking at ethnic pay gaps or release data on it. I don't know, that's just what I've observed. And I think there's a whole, I mean, like, this is part of it, obviously, this whole kind of awareness raising around why we need to, but most organisations, just the last thing I'll say on this is, most organisations do have D&I strategies. They have goals, you know, the big ones have big goals around inclusion and so forth, but there's no way you can have a truly inclusive organisation when you don't look at your pay gaps, or you don't do anything with them. You can't have equity in this context. You can't have inclusion without equity.
Absolutely. And we've touched on a question, Judy, you raised it, and we've touched on the whole idea of intersectionality, which is a big, long, fancy word that can, but basically it means that not all women are the same, not all Māori are the same, and there's so many different different levels, I guess. And again, I guess that's not so much part of our nuanced conversation as well. We don't talk about things like class or all those kind of uncomfortable pieces. Has anyone got any thoughts on that? I mean, that's just another level of conversation. Lisa, any thoughts?
I think if ever there is a time for New Zealand as a whole to dive deep, that we're there. Um, Over and above COVID and how that has made everybody's life do a 90-degree sharp turn in some way or another, right on the back of that, having the Black Lives Matter, having New Zealand history taught correctly in schools, having Te Reo as a compulsory, regular, ordinary language in our schools, I think it's time for us to talk about our relationship with each other culturally and through race, and how we regard and disregard one another, not just Māori and Pākehā, but people who choose to migrate here and how they are mistreated when they are here. I think this is the time for those national conversations and some ownership and some, there is a place for shame to be a motivator to be better and do better.
Now we've got a great question here from Jo McNaughton. Thank you for asking it. And she's asking the panel, but particularly Phil Zila, around the whole question of merit and how that is used to, I guess, put us into boxes, and how you manage that when, I guess, who defines what is merit, who defines what is competency, and then not all of us have the opportunity to have the experiences where we get the opportunity to become full of merit. Have you had any thoughts about that in the council context?
Yeah, no, thanks Jo, and thanks for that question. So in short, what we're trying to do is redefine, in terms of redefining merit, is saying that competency in Te Ao Māori and tikanga is critical for senior leaders, and alongside of that, and it's, there's obviously a direct connection, is inclusive leadership capability. And so, for example, in senior customer facing roles, the ability to demonstrate how you respond or lead for diverse customers or stakeholders is a critical factor. So myself and the principal advisor for Māori responsiveness and the head of recruitment, we've been working with senior leaders as they're making these appointments to help reshape competencies in the job description, but also bringing it to life through the interview process and through that assessment process. So it's been really cool. It's been complicated, and I definitely don't want to paint a picture like we've got this sorted. It's complex, and there's always the issue of weighting. So if you're looking at, for example, financial acumen, but you've got a candidate who's got all these other amazing meritorious qualities, where does the weighting go, and et cetera, et cetera. So we're starting the conversation though, and we're starting to apply this. So that's how we're doing it. But it's a journey.
Yeah, it's a tough. Judy or Lisa, any thoughts around that whole concept of appointment on merit? It seems like apple pie, doesn't it? But when you start unpicking it, it becomes very uncomfortable very quickly, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does, but I think it's, like Fazila said, it's necessary. If we really want to put a stake in the ground and not go backwards, I think it also invites people to, ask those relevant questions. And if the question makes them uncomfortable, then ask them about why that is. And I think there's got to be a willingness for everyone to be accountable in that space, so it's not just, let's just leave it to the D&I team, because, when actually everyone should have a buy-in to that process.
Oh, good point, Judy. It's a leadership position, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. Lisa, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think being uncomfortable means you're probably tapping into things that need to be different, that have been long overlooked. So the merit conversation is absolutely critical to get some change and to get systemic change. Systems are made up of people, and so people need to have the conversations to support any mechanics that get changed along the way. So I think that the more uncomfortable we are, the more on track we probably are with moving things in the right direction.
Yeah, no, that's good advice, Lisa. And now looking forward, I guess if any time there's been the opportunity now, given that we're in this phase where everything is fluid and things are being questioned, Anjum asks an amazing question, and I think I'll get the responses from our panelists around it. She asks, in the post-COVID recovery, we have a lot of government, I guess, investment and a lot of, I guess, government potential to change the dial. But she also makes the point that the first tranche of that is going straight into industries that are perhaps male dominated. And she asks your thoughts about how we can use, I guess, this opportunity, though obviously for many it's been a very tough and will stay being a tough time. But could it also, given the level of government investment, be an opportunity to change the dial? She asks for your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there absolutely is an opportunity. I suppose, you know, my concern is that in this space, we, from an inclusion perspective and representation around Māori, Pacifica and ethnic peoples and women in particular, actually our challenge is not to lose ground. You know, so there's an opportunity to grow and to get better. I'm still worried that we're going to, in this process, as companies are restructuring and making decisions about people, all that stuff we know about bias, conscious and unconscious, all of those, preference for people like ourselves, with, you know, all the things we know that have, the systemic things that have held us back in terms of progression, could, if we're not conscious of them, have a greater impact. So probably, sorry, Anjum, that probably doesn't totally answer your question. I think there is huge opportunity, but we really need to focus on, you know, things like demographic impact analyses and, you know, how well are we keeping that monitoring of the data, and how are we making those people related decisions and investment decisions with that inclusion lens. I think.
Yeah, I would add to your, I think you've made great points. I'd add, and who's at the table when those decisions are being made, because we have a pattern. When I did an analysis around the pandemic committee, who was sitting around the table making decisions, and I tell you, it wasn't representative of the communities they were making decisions for. So yeah, we can make a huge difference, but we can also we can screw it up going forward too, can't we? Lisa, Judy, any thoughts?
Yeah, so the National Council of Women actually did a position paper on COVID and opportunities and potential areas of loss. So picking up on what you've shared, Fazila, is globally there is a huge concern that this pandemic will push inequality back. You know, we will lose ground. That's the global concern. So we absolutely can't lose sight of that. And I do think that the questions need to be really overt to the decision makers of what's in this conversation for Māori, what's in this conversation for Pacifica, what's in this conversation for our Asian whānau, and what's in this for women. So if those questions aren't even being asked and having the analysis done on what the answers are, then we already know where this will lead. We know the pattern of our decision makers to maintain status quo, to get easy runs on the board because they are scrambling. And I appreciate the need for the scramble, but we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater in this particular time. So this is the time for us to be loud and to be, you know, hugely direct around where are the gains that you claim will be coming to our people.
The other thing I would add, Jo, which might be tainted a bit of controversy, is that actually some of our own women can hold us back, and you know, in the sense of, if I think about just my kind of my own journey, that there was like I had these amazing Pākehā men. Think about them now, but they're but actually they were the ones who did the door opening. You know, it wasn't the other women who were at the leadership kind of tables. They were actually the Pākehā men. Wow. And, I don't even know why I'm crying, but you know, they were the kind of pointers for me to say, actually there are some of our male counterparts who actually see our value, you know, who are you know, they're on our side. So they're the ones that I would just go to and talk to try and get change happening, but they were so cognizant of that happening anyway, that you know, they were so aware of the space that it was bringing to the forefront. So not all the sisters were the ones who would support, who would awhi, who would mentor, but that's not my experience all the time. But I certainly see now the value that has enabled me to do for you know, young Māori Pasifika or migrant communities.
Judy, thank you for sharing that story, and it's a nice reminder that we all have a role to play moving forward, don't we? As women, a really important, powerful role to play. Now, our time is coming to an end. I knew it would fly by when you put a whole lot of wonderful women on a panel, and you have an amazing audience asking powerful questions. But I'd just like to giving my panelists a little warning here, because I'm going a bit off-piste. So I'm going to ask them each if they've got any final statements, particularly, I guess, their wishes, their hopes, their aspirations, or even some advice for us, those who are listening, those who are here in positions of power, or those, all of us have spheres of influence. What do you think we can all do so that we aren't leaving this legacy of such, you know, unacceptable ethnic pay gaps? And so there I go, I've kind of sort of filled a gap, so hopefully you've had a chance to think, panelists. Would anyone like to go first? Thanks, Lisa.
This is the time to be loud, this is the time to be visible, and this is the time to find your allies, whoever they may be. And this is the time to be what New Zealand always claims it is, which is fair and wonderful, and everyone has a fair go. This is the time to put the runs on the board in that particular whakaaro.
Here, Lisa. Judy.
Yeah, I agree entirely that the allies, in whatever shape they come in, have to be the ones that really understand the value behind the drive, and you know, and using those spheres of influence, using the ears of those that you know are going to be on board, you know, and just being so clear about continuing to open the door. You know, I think we're challenged with the roles that we have and the positions that we have, to not lose that opportunity, to not lose the level that influence can have for, you know, the next people coming through who look like us.
Absolutely, thank you. Thanks for sharing. And Felzila.
Thanks, Joe. So just, I suppose, two things. The first, and it's kind of a boring answer, I guess, but is the power of data. And, you know, some organisations don't even collect ethnicity data, so you couldn't, you know, they can't do this kind of analysis. So whoever's listening or whoever has that ability to influence, I think data is really powerful. The second is a bit more of a personal view. I think, you know, we're living in a kind of a post-colonial space where often minority groups we're often pitted against each other, and we're often pitted against Indigenous, our Indigenous brothers and sisters. And I think the power of, you know, of creating allies between Māori Pasifika and ethnic communities, although the histories are different, there is something in a common inequity that we're experiencing. I found that's been really powerful, and in council we have some very strong leaders, strong networks, formal and informal, and you know, it's because of them that I can talk about this work that's happening. It's because of all the Māori responsiveness work that's been in place that I can talk about what we're doing more broadly, and the Pacifica network similarly driving for the same outcomes. So I suppose I think there's value in all our allies, you know, whoever they be, Pākehā or whoever our allies can be, that we can work together around something that we believe in.
Oh, fantastic words there. So I have the very unenviable task of trying to sum up this incredibly rich conversation. So I'm not even going to try because I think we've covered such a huge range of topics. But if I go back to where we started, it's that the ethnic pay gap, the gender pay gap and the intersections between it aren't just numbers, they are whether people will sleep in a warm house tonight. And I think we need to sort of ground it in that reality. And some of us have the opportunity to earn and therefore to live perhaps in warmer houses and have full tummies tonight. And some of us don't. And while we can unpick a whole lot of reasons for that, ultimately it's about people and the structures in that we live in. I know we've talked a bit about the way forward because I think that's incredibly important. And if I summarise the actions that I've heard from the panel and the questions, there's very much, I guess, a personal piece here that this is about how we treat each other using, Judy's experience, who we open the door for, who we're supporting, and all of us will have people around us we can open doors for. So I think we should take that as an action on all of ourselves. We all have a sphere of influence to let another come through. But also many of us are in decision making, and many of us over the next 6 months or a year will sit on boards or be in organisations that will be making responses to COVID. And I guess we've made the point that this is an opportunity to build back better, but also there's immense risk that we do the opposite. So who's at the table, who's making the decisions, and whose perspectives are being brought into those decisions when you're working, I guess, at the level of your team, at the level of your organisation, and even, I guess, at the level of our sort of governments, whether it be local government or central government. We do have an opportunity to input into policy making processes through those perspectives. So, and we also transverse the idea about pay transparency. If we can't see the problem because it's there but not quantified, it can easily be swept under the carpet. So if we have the opportunity, even if it's for our own, the own little space that we have some control over, to create that transparency, once you start to see the patterns and once you start to see it, I think with all good integrity, we have to move forward. So we can all get in behind any campaigns, and I know Karina, the amazing EEO Commissioner, is driving forward on this, and we're all behind you there. Because if you're a great organisation and you're doing great things, showing your gaps shouldn't be a problem. And even if they are there and you're working towards them, look what happens to organisations who show leadership in that space. They're actually rewarded for it. So that brings our session to an end. Thank you all for being part of this conversation. Thank you all for all the actions I know you're now going to take. Thank you to our amazing panelists, Lisa, Judy and Felzila. Your insights and passion are amazing and inspiring. Ka kite, everybody. Stay safe and stay warm, and hopefully stay dry if you're anywhere that's raining as much as it is here. And we'll see you again sometime soon. Ka kite.
Ka kite. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Tō whā.